All right. Hello, my friends, and welcome back to another episode of the Health Detective Podcast by Functional Diagnostic Nutrition. My name is Evan Transu, aka Detective Ev, and I will be your host for today's show, episode number 329 of the Health Detective Podcast. And we're going to be talking about trauma today. I do have a quick update for people that are listening live. If you're on audio, I either edited this out or you still need to listen to this, so check it out. You are probably listening to this in the midst of our soon-to-be Holistic Health Week if you're on audio, and if you're on the video live side, then this is coming out next week. So Holistic Health Week is basically where I've been saying FDN decided I don't do enough interviews, and so we're going to do an extra 30 in a month, and then we're going to do it all in 1 week, basically. So thank God the recordings are done beforehand, but we are going live next week. Holistic Health Week is free with 30 interviews, and how they're different than the podcast, excuse me, is that the podcast is normally a bit more story based, and this is just diving into the nerdy content. So if you want to get access to that, we will get you guys a link here. And Tracy, I probably should have had that. So if you don't mind, at some point, if you could copy and paste the thing from our recent podcast, it'll be under the click here thing, and then we can share that for you guys. So that's how well prepared I am, Tina, right? All right, I'm going to read our guest's bio today, and then we will get into today's topic. Tina is a certified practitioner who specializes in holistic wellness and trauma coaching. She believes that our past experiences shape who we are, and by unpacking and understanding these experiences, we can achieve personal growth. From disordered eating and an unhealthy relationship with food to competing in physique competitions and facing hormonal imbalances, her journey to holistic health was a long and challenging one. She tried different therapies and sought answers for years until she discovered the power of functional diagnostic nutrition, and her experience led her to understand the critical role that physical symptoms can play in perpetuating mental health conditions. She is now dedicated to empowering others to take control of their health and wellness journey. Welcome to the show, my friend.
Thank you so much, Evan. I appreciate it.
Cool. So we always start with the same question on this show. And that question is, what did your health symptoms look like? I know the bio gave us some clues there, but what specifically did your health symptoms look like, and when did they begin? Thanks, Tracy.
Yeah, so going back to around 2011, that's when I had been really controlling eating as little as possible for 4 years prior to that. And I wanted to make a shift in 2011. And I was in a world immersed with people entering into bodybuilding competitions. And I was like, this will be the way that I'll eat more. Amazing. So I ended up hiring a friend of mine to prep me for my first competitions. And then about 2 weeks out, he was unable to continue working with me. So I hired a different coach, and I went from not ready 2 weeks later on stage to the judges saying that I was over dieted. So from not dieted enough, 2 weeks later, over dieted. And then a few weeks later, I ended up winning first place in my second competition of the year. Wow. Then I went into a bulking phase because in my first year of competitions, I actually competed 7 times, which is crazy if you know the sport.
I know enough to know that that's accurate. That's crazy, yes.
Yeah, and that's how I do things, right? Yeah. Like I just dive right in. So from my first spring competitions into my fall ones, I had to put on some lean mass. So I went into bulking phase, and then I came into my fall competitions, and I just noticed that I wasn't able to really lean out the way I had in my first competitions. I was single digit body fat, like I was lean, and then I got on stage in the fall and I did not feel ready to be on stage, and I just could not drop at the time what I believed was body fat. Turmoil with my coach. I was so upset that I got up on stage. And then we put that season to rest in January of the following year, because this was fall of 2011. I spent the next 2 years, 2011 to 2013, continuously trying to get into competition mode. And it was just 2 years of absolute hell. Anybody that has an eating disorder, or at least my irrational thought process, there's often irrational thought processes with eating disorders, but mine was that fat is permanent. And for 2 years, multiple coaches, multiple naturopaths, that irrational thought just kept getting exacerbated, and it was more believable and more believable. Um, Eventually the fat became bloating, and I was so bloated. And that's where, those symptoms shifted from fat to bloating, and I was going to naturopaths. Things were being thrown out at me from naturopaths about adrenal fatigue, food sensitivities, so many things like that. I didn't have the resources to invest in anything further for testing at that time, but it was just this vicious cycle of me trying to do research and really understand, like, why was I bloating? I remember I was on one meal plan where a coach had me on half a green pepper every day, because that's the world. And in my research and through food logging, I ate the green pepper and I just got so bloated. I looked like I was carrying a child. Like, I was so bloated. And in research, I saw that green peppers can maybe be gaseous. Like, I was spinning my wheels for a few years. And that's kind of where it started.
Okay. There's a lot to unpack here, because I was already kind of surprised by the 2 competitions that quickly. I'm like, all right, you're maintaining pretty low for a good amount of time, and then you hit me with 7. So I'm like, all right, damn, this is quite a lot. I find it interesting, first of all, how much overlap there is between FDN practitioners and this group of people who are very serious about the physique side of things. And I shouldn't even say it's as common now. We certainly see that overlap. Like the first wave of FDNs, I don't know if you ever really talked to a lot of them. A lot of those individuals were also very into this stuff. And I think it's a natural overlap that you'd want to know more about your body and the labs and all these things. And thankfully you're doing it for the health reasons too. Just so people understand, single digits for a woman is not like a normal thing that should be maintained at all. From the bodybuilding side, I know that it's something that probably has to be done for a temporary period just to compete and be in the game. And I'm actually someone who is super big on people following their dreams and their passions and stuff. So I know this is a health podcast and we're talking about trauma today, so there's a lot here, but I have to ask first, what's your opinion on all of this now? Is there a healthy level that anyone can do this? If it really is their dream, can they do it a couple times every now and then? Or sorry, I should say, could they do it once or twice a year every now and then and compete? Or is this just something that society has told women, oh yeah, you guys should be competing and going into single digit body fat percentages? Or is this something we should move away from? And not that you have to give a strong opinion on it. I just want to know what you think about this now.
It's funny you asked that. If I could go back, I remember meeting a girl at a nightclub before my first competitions, and I was like, I'm going to take control of my eating disorder by doing bodybuilding. And I was outside with her, and she's like, please don't do that. And if I could go back in time, I would have listened to her. I didn't mention, because it's funny now, I think back, and there's things where like should have been red flags to me and weren't, but I had amenorrhea for a year when I was competing.
And for those who don't know, including me, what is that?
So I lost my menstrual cycle for a year.
Oh, okay.
And I went to the doctor, and she's like, yeah, gymnasts experience it. You're low body fat. It's fine. And, I was like, okay, well, it's fine. I'm an athlete. It's great. I think there's a healthy way to do it. And I did do it a healthier way down the line. But at that point, I think my body was so far gone that my symptoms still didn't allow me to show up great on stage, but it was definitely a healthier way. I didn't cut my carbohydrates. I was eating more leading into competition. I didn't deplete water the way I did with my first round of competitions. I think there's a healthier way. I don't think 7 times in a year is a good idea. I don't think doing it. I think anybody who struggles with an eating disorder should definitely avoid it, because it just exacerbates it. And the reality is you are the least healthy the second that you're on that stage. And you can't maintain that physique the second you step off that stage.
Yeah, it's a wild sport, and I appreciate that, because I think that's an objective opinion on it. There are crazy things that all of us do health-wise or stress-wise, so I don't think this is the worst thing ever if you're actually balancing it, if it's actually your dream, if it's the one main thing that you're really putting your body under, but that's not what I typically see with this. And for those watching, I feel like this might be one where people are a little less hesitant to share, like, oh yeah, I've been through this too. But for whatever it's worth, if you are someone that has been through something like this is actually shockingly common. Like, and you know this probably from working with people. It's like, I have heard this type of exact person, especially women, multiple times. Menstrual cycle's gone, like they feel like crap, hormones are tanked, and they are still pushing right along to go do these things. Actually, someone said, love you, Tina. Oh, that's awesome. So thank you for whoever that is. It was J and K. I don't know if you know them, and they added some hearts. But
Oh.
this is something that happens very often. I won't mention names, but I've worked with people in my age range that this was happening to them in like their early 20s, and I'm like, oh my goodness, like. And then again, they do validate the lack of cycle to themselves because they're like, oh, well, my friend doesn't have one, or this person doesn't have one. And I'm not suggesting you had this mindset, but some people even say, oh yeah, it's so much more convenient not having one. I'm like, holy cow, what are we doing in society where the 20-something-year-old woman thinks that this is a good thing? So I appreciate you bringing light to this. And I didn't know this. This is not where I expected the story to go. So this is interesting. Now, of course, the title today is regarding trauma. And so somewhere along the lines here, we're about to connect something that happened, or some things that happened, I suppose, to the manifestation of these eating disorders or disordered eating, and some of the other stuff that you dealt with. So to the degree that you want to today, let's dive into that side. When did you start to make a connection between trauma and these later things that you were experiencing?
Yeah, and I think, having learned under Gabor Mate, he talks about like big T trauma, big and small T trauma. And, if I look back at my life, like my parents are wonderful people. I had a great life. But I remember, my sister was overactive thyroid. She had to be on medication her whole life because she had issues from a young child. So she was always super lean. And I remember conversations when I was a little girl about, it's baby fat. She's carrying baby fat. Only one dessert today, no more dessert. There was so much of that when I was little. And then I internalized that. And I always remember comparing myself to my sibling. And I was chunkier. Like I was 7, 8, 9 years old. I was carrying more fat than my sister. But as a little girl, I never thought that she had a medical condition where, thyroid removed, like that's causing issues that are making her much leaner than I am. And that hung with me for a very long time. I would say up until a year ago when I was finally able to realize that my mental and physical pieces were very connected. But that's where I think that stemmed from, because I know consciously I was making an effort to eat less by the time I was 21. But if I think back subconsciously, I don't think I ever ate lunch in high school. Wow. I think I was drinking coffee for lunch.
I feel so, and not that I should have known this, but I feel so ignorant looking back, because there were particularly young women who like they did this at lunch all the time, but I didn't realize what was happening, right? In fact, it sucks because we were almost bringing attention to them, saying like, oh, come on, eat something today. And it's like, you're just stupid. You're 15, right? You don't know like what someone's actually dealing with if you haven't dealt with that kind of stuff. Mind you, I'm dealing with my own mental health things at the time, completely unaware that this individual in front of me might also be dealing with their own things. And perhaps that's why they're not eating anything. I'd like to touch, I guess, on this specific type of trauma a little bit more if we can. And what I mean by that is, regardless of whether or not it's irrational, because you brought that up, that's fine, but what is the thought process that's occurring as this is happening? Because, I think a lot of people that don't understand this, and perhaps I'm even in that group, fall into this belief that someone that is worried about gaining fat or gaining a bunch of weight is, doing it to be more attractive. Now, the irony is, especially like, let's take someone who has anorexia, and there was someone in high school that I knew with this. That's who I'm kind of referring to when I was bringing up that example. You look at what happens to their body, and it's not that you're literally judging them, but you would think anyone has to realize that this isn't healthy. This is no longer attractive to anyone. So it's not just that. It has to come from something deeper. So if I may ask, what's the actual mindset around this? Because I've heard some people say control, but that feels like a very loose answer. I'm sure it's part of it, but I'd love to know more about what's happening to someone as they're going through this.
Yeah, and I never got to that anorexic piece. And I think because I was in the fitness world, prior to that, I was close with my sister who also struggles with the same disordered eating. It is in my family, you know? So for me, it was always normal. I didn't know normal. I didn't know that I would actually be diagnosed until I was 6 months pregnant with my second child. And I was diagnosed. And I was like, really? You think? Because I'm surrounded by it. Like, I'm in the fitness world. This is what everybody does. And the psychiatrist was like, no. You're 6 months pregnant and not nourishing your body. That is not standard. So it is, I think, control, because if you looked at my, what I was doing before competing, it was, a bagel every day at a specific time, coffee at a specific time. Sundays would be like my binge day. Mondays would be where I made up for it. And then competing was, like I said, half a green pepper, 5 asparagus spears. Like, to think back now, I'm like, 5 asparagus spears. Like, what would happen if I had 6?
Right.
So it's just such a wild ride to be in the mind of somebody going through that. And I used to say that to my husband. I'm like, I know this is exhausting for you, but to be up here, 10 times worse, because I can't even explain it.
So is there almost this odd, are there these little odd blips of calmness within the chaos? And I'm trying to think of a good analogy. The first one that came to my head, whether or not this is good, I'm not sure. But I've always been very afraid of planes. Thankfully, I got over it enough to start flying all the time now. But there was a 13-year period I didn't fly at all because it was that bad. It's like I got near an airport with no plans of flying. I was nervous and my palms would start sweating. And now one of the things, or actually I've gotten better at this, but when I first started flying again, one of the things I would do, Tina, is I would sit at the window. Now, the reason I'm trying to use this as an analogy is because I'm at the window, which did give me this false sense of control, which would provide these short moments of clarity or calm. But in reality, I'm still on the damn plane, and I'm still definitely in the mindset that I'd rather be on the ground. So is the controlling of the food and the, hey, it's the 5 asparagus sticks and all this kind of stuff, is it just the equivalent of that, where it's like, all right, for a second I get some calmness, some peace, but really I'm on the plane the whole time and I'd definitely rather be on the damn ground?
Yeah, I think you're living in fear mind as opposed to like rational mind most of the time. There's actually studies that show people with an eating disorder, the longer they have it, the blood flow in their brain actually goes more to the emotion centers than to the logical centers of their brain. So you are functioning more on emotion than on logical, rational sides of your brain.
I've never heard that. I believe it. That's cool to learn something new about it. Is there evidence that it gets better when the person starts eating correctly?
I would say, because our minds, the synapses and things, I have worked with plant medicine. That was a big part of my journey to healing. And there is studies that show that plant medicine does help with rewiring those patterns as well. But, even in therapy, they call it wise mind versus emotion, or whatever the other mind they call it. I don't remember now, but I would wake up in the morning and I'm like, today's the day. Today's the day I'm going to eat more. And then you get to that first meal and you're like, nope, not happening today. Yeah. And there's just something that sets in. And it was even to the point where, there was one macronutrient, like fats were terrifying for me. So if there was a sprinkle of olive oil on my broccoli, I'd be like, oh my God. Oh my gosh. Like, I'm going to get fat. And I would say it, I would vocalize that. So it was definitely just living in extreme fear all the time.
Yeah. And I think you already used this word. This sounds exhausting.
It was exhausting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is like, because food is such an integral part of everything that we do on a daily basis. It's like, you can't avoid this. And so it implies that, like, here's the difference for me on a plane. When I'm not flying, right? And if I'm not passing an airport, I don't really think about it. Food, how are you avoiding that one? At least if you're not eating, everyone else is. So, this is constant kind of living on the plane. And I know I'm tired after a 3-hour flight, let alone if I'm doing this every day for years on end. So, wow. Okay. When did you decide, and I'm sorry if I'm jumping ahead here a little bit, so feel free to add anything in if it needs to be, but when did you decide that you wanted to incorporate this and do this as a part of your coaching? Because I mean, it sounds like you went through quite a bit with this, and now to go help others with it is really amazing. So I'd love to know how we got there.
Yeah, so I went through a lot of years, marriage, babies. We ended up relocating from Canada to the Dominican Republic. And in that time, I actually completed a certification in psychedelic prep and integration. And through there was an instructor that actually brought in this functional health work into her lessons on addiction recovery and alcoholism. And I had always loved nutrition and fitness, and I was fascinated. She talked about cravings for alcohol when your blood sugar drops. And I was like, wow, this is fascinating. So I ended up paying to do a session with her to understand what path she took to incorporate these two worlds. And in that journey with her, she told me about FDN. And in my own work, I remember working with a coach one day where I was like, I've done mental health work, but I genuinely wake up flat. And when I put water in my mouth, I bloat. Yeah. So maybe this isn't just about my mental health. Like maybe I'm just really uncomfortable and don't want to be bloated. And that's where I started to piece together, I always knew mind and body were important, but like they're really connected. And I found FDN because of this one coach. And that's where I said, I need to make sure, and it's a line that I always say, but we're not floating heads or headless bodies walking the earth. And I remember in one of the first times that I listened to Elizabeth speaking, I can't remember what it was, but during the course, she was speaking. And, plant medicine, ketamine clinics are popping up on every corner in the US. And she was talking about hormones. And, we can say somebody's clinically depressed, but if their testosterone's in the tank, are they mentally clinically depressed, or is it their hormones? And I was like, I'm doing the right thing. Yeah. Because when people show up to do ketamine, they're treatment-resistant depression, but we're not looking at anything physical. And that was, confirmation for me that I really needed to be a practitioner that was looking at the whole person, past experiences, mind, body. And because of my journey, and, now I'm completely on the other side of the physical symptoms, and I'm reverse dieting. I was eating under 1,000 calories for a decade. And I'm reverse dieting now, and I love food. I was like, this is what I want for people to resolve everything that's happening.
Yeah. And just because it's actually a little concerning how often, even in this space of functional medicine and holistic health, people do not understand the calorie thing. Just so you guys know, under 1,000 calories for unless you literally have some, I can't, I shouldn't even say it like that, because really a toddler, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think like late stage toddlers should be eating more than that. So there's no sized person that should actually be eating that. I'll correct myself. So that is not normal. We need more than that to get through the day, just so you guys know. And I liked what you said about, this is tough, and I'm not a doctor or psychologist, so I think it's a fine line, but it's a line that really should be discussed more. You talked about how, no, I really do bloat. Now, should that lead to the reactions that you had with all this stuff? No, but there was real symptoms happening. I see this a lot with panic attacks, because that's something that I dealt with. There are real people that are having histamine reactions sometimes, and maybe they have palpitations, and that triggers the panic attack. Okay, so you do have a mental health condition here, but you also have real symptoms that actually need to be investigated. And so regardless of which one comes first, it could be a little bit different for everyone. You're valid in both of these areas. You're not invalid in one or the other. And I think this can happen in both spaces. I think Western medicine can kind of dismiss the one, and I think functional medicine practitioners sometimes can dismiss the other. And I really think we need a more integral approach, which is like why you're perfect for probably the people that you work with, because it sounds like you just so naturally integrate both of these things. So if I may ask this question, when you were going through FDN, for those that don't know, we include labs in the cost of tuition. So you're your first client. That's intentionally part of the course. What the heck, if you remember, came up on those? Because I'm imagining the hormones had to be tanked at that point, and I'm just curious about anything else that might have come up.
Yeah, my estrogen was tanked. My cortisol in FDN world, exhaustive phase, my cortisol was tanked. Pylori, parasite, overgrowth in some of my quote unquote bad opportunistic bacteria, definitely huge signs of inflammation. So my calprotectin, which is a marker for inflammation, was very elevated to the point where, if there wasn't some other things going on, potentially looking at colonoscopy to make sure everything was healthy there, but just definite signs of inflammation. My estrogen pathways, I was using the inflammatory pathway equivalent to what I should have been using, the more supportive pathway. So they had like swapped places. So just lots of inflammation. And I knew the body was super cool. Like I knew nutrition and fitness, but I was like, congested liver? Like, what is that? What do you mean? And the parasite too, and now thinking back, if you have a weak host, that's when things can take up rent in your body or space in your body. And when I was competing, I was such a weakened host, and I think, and, I also didn't mention, but part of the bodybuilding space, I got implants, and were those contributing to the inflammation? So just tons of that, but hormones, parasite, H. pylori, overgrown bacteria. There was so much that I was nervous. And I remember saying to my mentor, like, how do you tell people that they have congested liver and this and that wrong without freaking them out? And her and I got along so well, but she said, knowledge is power. Mm-hmm. And this is going to lead you to a space where you can rebalance everything.
Geez, oh my God, I didn't even think about the breast implants thing and how common that probably is with female bodybuilders. But male bodybuilders too, not the breast implant side, but the unhealthy half. Yeah, not that, but the unhealthy side. Because I think there is no space worse than the bodybuilding one where you have people that, again, the ones that are, especially for males, maybe not natural, or just even women. I think even if they're in the natural competitions, they're still killing themselves pretty severely there. You have no group of people that to the outside world, they like is perceived as more like healthy or disciplined, but really like they're dying on the inside. Like if I went and did bodybuilding right now, even at a high level, a lot of my family would misinterpret that and say, oh my gosh, he's like, look at all the stuff that he's doing, whatever. It's like, dude, these are major stressors on the body. And I'm not suggesting that there's not a proper way to do this, but it's, whoa, like you better know what the heck you're doing, and you better know what your goals are and how far you're willing to go with this so that you can maintain your health. And okay, I'll get off the soapbox with that, but this just comes up so much, and I feel so bad for people because these are some of the trickiest clients to work with. I mean, they're really into it, and you guys are very disciplined, which is great. But yeah, so, and J and K said again, yes, thank you. Anxiety is not just mental; it can be from imbalance or histamine. Absolutely, right? True for a lot of different health conditions. So, all right, now knowing what you know, and I'm sorry that we jumped around a bit. It's just like this was a cool story. I didn't expect this today, but. Now knowing what you know, how do you help people even address the initial traumas? I love that you talked about big T versus little t, because whether it's genetics, perception, whatever it might be, time of one's life, whatever it might be, there's a variety of things that could actually be classified as trauma. And I think we almost dismiss ourselves if it wasn't something major, or similarly, if it was too major, we look at it as like unfixable. And you know what, man, we've had people on this show that have come through just about everything you can imagine. I'm sure we'll get something new tomorrow, but you have just about everything you can imagine. I've seen them get to the other side. So how can people even start to, I guess, identify some of the stuff that might be contributing to what they're dealing with now? Because correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like you might not have had this, like you speak about the trauma now as if like, oh yes, I did this because of my sibling and there were some other things. I'm doubting that you had that clarity throughout all these years of the bodybuilding stuff, correct?
I did, but I know a lot of people who don't.
Okay. All right. So fair enough. You get what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So how can we
Yeah.
help them even identify this?
For some reason, Evan, people, I don't know if it is an inherent natural tendency for me. And I, like I mentioned before we got on, I worked at a max cure psychiatric facility. I've worked with so much trauma my whole life. And I don't know what I do to provide a safe container, but people naturally bring things up to me. And then I sit there and unpack it with them. And I help them correlate it to what they're dealing with. So I don't have to dig really, because it seems to be something that just people come forth with. And then I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Like, why do you think that might be going on?
Sure. Well, then I can ask for the next step. And by the way, that's because you come across as you're you. You're very real. This is who I am. This is the story. Take it or leave it. And it's very approachable. So I can understand that. So then the next question would be, I assume the people that are watching this today or listening afterwards or listening to the audio, they probably wouldn't click on this unless they maybe had some awareness around the trauma side. So the next step would be, okay, now I know I have some of this and I'm still watching myself engage in the habits that maybe were created because of this, or engaging in the bad things that were created because of this. And I think that's almost sometimes the worst place to be, when like we know why things are happening, which it sounds like you said you knew of this a lot of times, and yet you're still experiencing it. That's got to be stressful in its own right. It's like, I know this and I can't stop. So how do we help people start getting on the right track then, if they have identified the traumas that they might have dealt with?
Yeah. And I think it's first acknowledging that your behaviors serve a function, and it's typically those were started to protect you from something. So for me, that restrictive eating, if I restrict myself, then nobody else can force me to restrict. Right? When I was little, there was that one dessert. But now if I control my food, nobody else can control that. So, for example, I remember working with someone who was dealing with insomnia, and this person spoke to the fact that as a little girl, naps and sleep were seen as lazy. And I was like, okay, well, let's unpack that. Let's resolve that. Let's let that little girl know that it's okay to rest. So it's really providing that safe container for people that are recognizing that they have tendencies that might be rooted in something from their past. It's giving yourself the grace and knowing that those behaviors were there to protect you, and stop getting upset with yourself for having those behaviors, because they were there to protect you.
So it's something that the threat's probably no longer there, is what you're saying, and yet we're still living as if it is unintentionally, and now we have to almost rewire something like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. And is there, I don't know if this can be done generically, I suppose, because I guess everyone's trauma is a little bit different, right? So are there, though, general rules of thumb to actually help kind of unwire some of this stuff? Like what I'm getting at is there something that we can do when we find ourselves becoming conscious of, oh, I'm doing that again, or I'm experiencing this again? Is there something that we can do to kind of halt that process, or at least slow the progression before it takes over?
Yeah. And this is a tool that's talked about in a few of like the brain retraining pieces, but that, pattern interrupt piece, that's something that I've been working with some clients on, is really noticing. And the first time might take you 10 minutes to interrupt a pattern, but the more you interrupt that pattern, you'll start to catch on to it more quickly. And it's a practice, right? For me, realizing, okay, because it still happens sometimes where I'll say, my reverse dieting is going very slowly because I'm inching up my calories, because I think when you've been dealing with chronic health conditions for so long, and I've seen it in clients, there is a little bit of that. I don't want to say PTSD, but it's like, when's that morning I'm going to wake up bloated again? And how long is it going to last this time? So there is a little bit of that trauma piece still. And so inching up my calories is very scary, but recognizing that voice in your head and being like, today I'm choosing not to hear it. I hear you. I see you. I'm going to wave hello to you, but then I'm going to let these thoughts pass on through, because stopping the thoughts isn't really the name of the game. It's just recognizing them and allowing them to keep going through.
Mm-hmm. I think this stuff can be, kind of going back to the recognition part. It's like, I think it can be super tough to recognize, and perhaps we recognize one or two things and then maybe not another one. This is something I share infrequently, but frequently enough, I guess, on the show. But I always like to bring this up just so people know that everyone kind of goes through this. One of the most profound realizations I ever had with this kind of trauma stuff, and then understanding that it was self-sabotage, right? Which I know comes up a lot with these types of things, was with acne. And so I had a very severe cystic acne case at one point. And then when I had that, it was my interpretation that, okay, there's no point in like attempting to date, right? Which I very much wanted to do as a young man. I would love to do that, but it's like, okay, the case is so bad, you don't even try with this. And some people might not like this, but this is, again, kind of where I draw a line with stuff. Yeah, man, if it's the worst case in the world, that might not be putting your best step forward right now, or foot forward into the dating world. Maybe we get it a little bit, but just because you have one breakout on the opposite end of this, just because you have one breakout doesn't mean that you can't date either. Like there's levels to what we're talking about here. And somehow in my head, I started associating that any breakout whatsoever meant, okay, I'm no longer worthy of doing this. Now, if you know, as a health coach and an FDN, and you kind of know the bad stuff that exists in this world of the chemicals and the modern food system, and you've dealt with acne as one of your symptoms, it's not really that hard to get a breakout if you eat the wrong thing or try this stuff. So I found myself in stressful situations, not just potential intimate relationships, but also it might have been like an interview or a speech or something that I had to show up for that was otherwise uncomfortable, regardless of acne or skin stuff. I found that I would start doing the things that I knew wouldn't serve me or my skin and would cause something like a breakout. And I could use that as the excuse to not have to participate in the thing. So like, I'll make up a lie and say I'm sick that day when really I just broke out. So there's like a whole web of stuff that I'm tricking myself with here. So I'm lying saying I'm sick. I'm really not sick. It's actually the breakout. The breakout wasn't even the core of the issue, and I'm the one who caused it with self-sabotage. Yeah, man, that took a while to realize some of those things. So my point in mentioning that too is, do you find that when you're working with clients, or perhaps even with yourself, are there layers to some of the trauma habits that we develop, trauma defense mechanisms? Because some of my stuff was really easy to recognize. That took years to recognize. So is this like an onion where you got to peel back the layers sometimes?
Yeah, I think so. I definitely think there's layers to it that we have to work with people. But I also think, so it's a different space when you're working with plant medicine and trauma. It's different from therapy, where in therapy, there's like this hierarchy. So the therapist heals the client or the patient. But in coaching through trauma, it's my job to hold safe space, because it's the client's journey to peel back those layers in a safe time for them. But I definitely agree that there are layers, and I can see them in myself, because bloating, also like acne, can happen.
Quite easily.
Yes, quite easily. And there are times still, even though I'm on the other side of things, where I'll use that as an excuse to, oh, maybe today I won't eat as many calories, because I'm using those things that are coming up to sabotage my progress, because that was comfortable for me. Like my eating disorder, and I've said this to other clients with depression and anxiety, it's familiar for you. It kept you safe for so long. My eating disorder kept me really safe. So it's easy to kind of crawl back to that and sabotage in that way.
Thank you, not only for your transparency with that, but really the whole show so far. But I think it's cool to have people on that are just enough steps ahead that they can be useful to others, but are still, in a sense, on the journey with them, right? It's that much more relatable. And it kind of leads me to this question of, I know everyone's journey is going to take a different amount of time. obviously, if you asked someone that would be the answer. But I don't know. I think for me, where I would be worried is like, how do we know if we're not actually moving along at the pace that we should? For example, it sounds like, I mean, at least from what you've told us so far, it sounds like you're on a very reasonable pace. Yeah, I still have some days where I go back to this, but okay, cool. It sounds like progress is being made there. I feel like I have heard stories from people, and I won't list names, of course, but I've heard stories from people, even people calling me from a client perspective, that I'm listening, and it's both the logical side of me, but just the intuition side saying, this person's stuck on like a hamster wheel with this. And like, yes, maybe they do go 2 steps forward, but it's not 1 step back, they go 2 steps back. So
Mhm.
is there, I'm sorry if it's too tough of a question. I guess I don't know how else to ask it. Is there a way to see if we're actually making reasonable progress, or we're just tricking ourselves into thinking, oh yeah, I'm doing it. But really we kind of end up back up in the same place? Cause I see that a lot. And these people end up in trauma healing for like 15 years, 20 years, and there's no end in sight. Do you know what I mean? Do you see this too?
Yeah, and I think that's their journey.
Okay.
I think that's their journey. It took me, I mean, my journey was over 10 years.
Yeah.
So I think that's their journey. And I don't think that healing or recovery or anything like that is linear.
Mhm.
I think it is this dance. And we have to be okay with that dance, because if we're not, then we never start the dance.
Mhm.
If we have to be, for example, if you have to be sober to ever start addiction recovery, when do you start? You know what I mean? So I think you have to be okay with that dance and allow that person to have their journey, however long that's going to be, as long as they are safe.
Mhm. Okay. Something that I apply to myself, and I genuinely want your honest feedback with this, because you know more about this than me, and you're actually coaching people in this way. One of the things that I've tried to do, because I dealt with substance abuse and all these kinds of things. So I try to look at the months and even the years rather than the days, because if I do look day by day, it's like, no, sometimes it sucks, man. Like, so I have to almost go to the months and the years, and I say, and let's just use the year one because that's low hanging fruit. That's easier. If I say, okay, am I doing better right now this year so far than last year? And like, thankfully for the last 10 years, I'm able to say almost every single year, yeah, no, man, of course I'm better than last year. It's not perfect now, but I'm definitely better off than last year. Is that like, do you think it's a fair way, regardless of whether or not people have individual journeys? I definitely believe in that. But do you think that's a fair way to measure it, is to like, hey, look at the big time frames here and say, are we making progress year by year? And if we are, then hell yeah, let's keep going until we get to where we need to go.
100%.
Okay.
I had a client who measured her progress in months, and I can tell you she was mentally so much more ahead of the game than ones that measured it daily.
Yep.
And I'm the same. I look at myself a year ago where I wasn't going swimming with my kids. I wasn't eating their birthday cake. Now I'm like, we have 3 cakes for one birthday and I'm eating everything and I'm in a bikini and I'm with my kids. And like, I went from detesting my body, thinking that it was, my body hated me, to loving my body and realizing that really it was begging me for help. And that's within a year. But if I look at my day to day, there's bloating days, there's up and down days. And definitely I think that it has to be the bigger picture.
That's awesome. I think you brought up the example of addiction, and that immediately resonated, because I'm thinking, okay, if I went day by day with that, you're like, okay, well, if you had to be sober to start addiction treatment, like that would never really work, right? If you went day by day with something like that, of course you could say, oh my God, well, look, I drank today, or I smoked today, or I did this today. Of course I'm worse off. I didn't do that yesterday. But if you looked at each year and you said, well, last year I did this every day, and this year I've done it maybe 60 days. Maybe you've done it 60 days out of the year. But holy crap, if you said 365 days versus 60, anyone could see that that's huge progress, even if most people might not be at the 60 thing. So it's not that we want to play around with this stuff either. Don't get us wrong. Tina and I aren't encouraging that. I mean, obviously substance abuse is serious and these other things are serious, but we do need to give ourselves some grace in these journeys if we're trying to rewrite stuff that's been going on for years, not to mention often since our developmental years. So when the brain is like solidifying these patterns and habits, to think that this is going to change in a day or a week is, I think you'd be the first. I don't know many people who have done something like that. So I love this. I love your whole approach to this. And I think it's because you've been in it that you probably have this very real and very refreshing perspective on it. I think this is just relatable for people. I don't want to. I want to ask about the lab stuff a little bit more, so I'll just have to jump to that, and we can maybe do a part 2 at some point. But with the lab side and how this mixes all in, I have found that even people that come on the show, it's kind of usually a one or the other. It's like, hey, I'm either the trauma person or I'm either the lab person, because it's almost too much for them to mix it together. So I'm curious what your experience has been. How do you mix these together? Because I'm thinking about it, with all due respect, someone like you, like if you had a food sensitivity test or a metabolic typing thing at your worst, I can almost picture that being more of a stressor for you than it's worth at the time. Similarly, someone like me needed the labs at one point because I wasn't making any progress no matter how good I got with the other habits. So I'm just kind of curious how you mix that in a way that's still healthy for the client, because I could see both sides kind of being or having a negative impact depending on where the person's at currently in their journey.
So are you asking, how I incorporate those two worlds in working with them?
If someone was to work with you, yeah, how does that go? Where we
Yeah.
have this very objective lab side, and then we need to get into the more subjective, emotional trauma work side.
Yeah. So before we even get lab results, I look at lifestyle, and I think that is so important. And often in there, I'll give you an example of a client. She was weight loss resistance, but she lost weight when she moved to work overseas. To me, I was like, okay, red flag. What's happening in her home country that's not happening overseas that's allowing her to lose weight? And so I asked those questions. And like I said, people seem to open up to me. And from that question, what's different overseas? Like what changes, what stressors do you have at home? And then things opened up about mental health in her family. She's a primary caregiver. So I was like, okay, great. So now here's that trauma piece. We have the lab piece. Let's work on the parasites and stuff, but let's unpack a little bit in our sessions. So I do a lot of, bi-weekly we'll get together. So it's not just review labs and be on your way, but I use those bi-weekly sessions to dive into some of those more trauma, emotional, mental health pieces and talk through those with the client.
Cool. I love that. Just such an astute observation with that person too. And I'm sure you have more examples like that, but it's like, I've been doing this for a while. I don't even know if I would have thought to ask that question of like, hey, what's happening in the home country that's not happening here? It's like, okay, well, when you say it like that, it's like, duh, but these are the unique things that you get with someone who's trained in this stuff and actually has done the work. So very cool. In terms of people that could work with you now, not that as FDNs we can't help anyone. We actually specifically say we don't treat anything specifically. That's true. But also from a business perspective, I think most people that listen to this show understand fully at this point that we have our particular groups of people that we just love to help. And also there's certain people that we just resonate with better that we can serve the most. So I'd love to hear about who your ideal client is. And the reason I'm asking that is because there's going to be someone that is watching right now or listening to this in the future that says, hey, I've loved Tina so far. I want to know if I'm her person, like if I could actually go work with her and she would love to work with me. So who are the ideal clients that you're like, oh, I love when they come to me because I know I can help them?
Yeah, I would love to help women, that feel like they're spinning on this wheel and just feeling in desperation, but so health conscious and so motivated, that perseverance piece, because even through over a decade of me struggling, like I never gave up. I never gave up. And those are the women that I want to help. The women that they know that that confidence is there. And I want that to come to the surface again. I want them to no longer feel like they're lost in themselves. I want them to love their bodies again. And, I said to a friend the other day, I was like, I walk by the mirror now and it's the most beautiful but weird situation for me, because I actually look in the mirror and I love what I see now. And that's who I want to serve. I want women to love what they see, love themselves, and really just find themselves again. And it's not just about like physical body, but it is important. It is important to love your physical body. I always say I've always loved my brain, always, but it feels really nice to love my body too. And those are the women that I want to help. The ones that, where they're thinking, I'm eating all the right things, I'm doing all the exercise and movement, and this is not the body that I want, given the work that I'm putting in.
That's so powerful. That's not something that I don't think I ever have enough gratitude for or talk about enough, but not that I relate for the body sense, I suppose, but the acne sense for sure. It's like, yeah, there was like a 12, 13-year period where you don't want to look in the mirror, right? It's like, actually, it sucks. And so, yeah, to look by now, it's like, okay, unfortunately, I'm not a model yet, but
Come on,
can I work with what I see? Yeah, I'm like, all right, I look in there, I'm like, I can work with that today. I think I could go figure this out. So that is definitely, it seems like such a simple luxury to have, but man, it's one that you wish you had when you don't have it. So I think that's really cool. It's a cool descriptor of something that you can help people with. And then, of course, Tina, where can they find you if they would like to work with you?
Yeah, so I'm most active on Instagram. So you can find me at wellness_rooted. And then on my website, which is wellnessrooted.co.
Okay. And we will share that below in just a second. If you're in audio, you can check the show notes for that. The final question, believe it or not, we're already at 50 minutes. The final question for today is our signature question that we finished the show with. And I know we've been talking about disordered eating and trauma today, but you can go anywhere you'd like with this question. It is this: if I gave you a magic wand and you could wave it and force every single person in this world to do one thing for their health, whether that's literally getting us all to start doing one thing, or you can force us to stop doing one thing, what's the one thing that Tina gets us to do?
I would say invest in it, because had I invested in it 11 years before financially, I wouldn't have invested in it for 11 years with my mental health.
Cool. Tina, thank you so much for coming on the show today. This felt like, I know that you were nervous before, so I won't say that.
So
But
nervous.
I felt like we could have talked forever, and you did a great job. I know that a lot of you guys are watching right now. This was, I'll just word it this way. If you guys appreciated this, I don't need to know your whole story. Just put thank you in, though. We'd really appreciate that, and I know Tina would too.